Welcome to Strength for Today's Pastor, conversations with current senior pastors and leaders which will strengthen and help you in your pastoral ministry. And now, here's your host, Bill Holdridge of Hoyman Ministries.
Welcome to podcast number 98. Once again, today we have Gayle Erwin with us, and our topic today is the body style, shaping today's church with the Jesus style. And for those of you who do not know Gayle Erwin, Gayle's a longtime pastor, author, conference speaker. As far as ministry is concerned, he's all about playing what he calls the one string he has on his guitar, which is the nature of Jesus. He's all in with regard to helping others understand who Jesus is and what that means as his servant. So today, we're going to be focusing on aspects of Gayle's book called The Body Style. So the questions are, how does the nature of Jesus connect with the developing of our churches and with the shape of the church? That's our subject. So welcome, Gayle. Thanks again so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for asking me. I'm delighted. I'm always kind of shocked and thankful, but I don't always get a chance to say that.
Our honor and our privilege, believe me. So let's just dive right in. I listened to your reading of The Body Style recently, and I was struck by a number of the ideas that are contained in that amazing book, again, which is an application of your book, The Jesus Style, and the things that you've learned and taught over the years about the nature of Jesus. But the reading of the book, it made me, frankly, it made me want to pastor again so I could get some things right. So what influenced or motivated you to write The Body Style, Gayle?
Well, I grew up in church. The very first Sunday I was in this world, I was in church. And I didn't miss a Sunday until I was 14 years old.
Wow.
So, I could boast about being a churchgoer as far as that was concerned. But I don't know, there's something about the way God let me view him that I've always been troubled by certain things that I see that I consider to be unnecessary or counterproductive, And so finally I felt like I've got to write this book. So I did. It's not as popular as my other books, I think, because maybe it's a little bit too harsh in a way, but I had to be.
Well, I didn't feel or sense the harshness at all. I felt like, wow, a pastor who wants to serve the Lord.
If you were a certain type of pastor, you would feel
yeah, I could see that.
That's not fair.
I could see that, but why not learn? So I just thought that was great. So that was what your upbringing in the church and what you've seen, and you mentioned that in other places too, how you just have, the Lord gives you things that you see that aren't typically seen or observed by others, and it forces you to want to do something about that.
Well, I found things that I thought, well, why do they do that? I think I might have mentioned to you one time. There would be maybe when the pastor would say, okay, they're to a congregation, which was, I think, kind of strange because that's too many people to ask that of. And there'd be a few public statements like, pray for my ingrown toenails or my split hair ends or so forth, which were very surfacey things. And I knew there were some other things to be prayed for. But then it would go silent, and then they would say, are there any unspoken requests? And every hand in the crowd would go up. And I would think, now that's heartbreaking, that we're in a group of people to whom we cannot really share our hearts and our needs.
So something needed to change there to create an environment where people could not be afraid and then go ahead and take the bold plunge into authenticity.
Which means smaller groups.
Yeah. Oh, I like that. Well, along that line, sort of, you wrote an entire chapter on the subject of simplicity in the book, The Body Style.
True.
And that's the title of the chapter. So you stated in that chapter, few things damage the church more than the complication and trivialization of theology. And then you mentioned that you have students who come to you and ask if they should go to seminary. That's an interesting question. I get that question sometimes too. What has been your response, and what practical advice did you give to those that have asked you that question?
Well, I would tell them, if you go to seminary, you're going to take in and kind of get a case of spiritual constipation. Then you're going to go to your first church and have a movement
Oh
that will
my.
take some years to clean up.
That's funny.
So if you're going to do any, and I don't frankly recommend too much graduate work in spiritual things, because this is something that even the simplest of us should be able to understand. Mm-hmm. And if you understand Jesus really and love him, that's enough. I mean, how much complication do you need anyway? The simplicity is the thing that matters. I even had a seminary president admit that we do not train pastors here. We train seminary professors.
Right.
Because that's the example they see. And I became, a certified, I forget what they call it, but they could come to my church as their last semester and participate in church. And I'd have them preach, and they would just preach the best thing they heard from one of their professors, but it would have nothing for my congregation. They'd be looking at each other and saying, "Who's Bart?"
Mm-hmm. Oh my. Well, you in your answer to that question, one thing that you wrote in the book was that you would tell some of these young men, you need to do something practical. You need to make your time worthwhile while you're here in seminary.
See if you can teach a class, Sunday school class of 9-year-old boys.
Wow. Yeah, and so what's your thinking there?
Then simplify it that much and get down to where they are. I mean, be a boy with them. And Jesus identified with us. Do you suppose he said, "Oh, Dad, do I have to go down there?" Mm-hmm. But when you identify with them, they will love you to pieces, let me tell you.
Mm-hmm. That's good. What if we did actually do that? We aimed our teaching ministry, our public teaching ministry, that in a way that a 9-year-old boy could effectively understand it. That would revolutionize a lot of things.
That would change a lot of things, but it would make your ministry so much more powerful.
Yeah. It's like J. Vernon McGee used to say, get the cookies down on the lower shelf where the people can reach them. And then Pastor Chuck Smith, he used to say, simply teach the word simply.
Yeah.
So that's great. Well, in another chapter in the book, you wrote about the organization of the church, and I know that for a lot of pastors, this is a very big subject. I know it was for me, Gayle, especially as more and more people started coming to the church and the church became larger in terms of attendance. I started thinking more and more about the organization of the church, and it created a deep tension for me, really. But maybe you could comment briefly on the styles of organization that churches use, and then focus mainly on the system Jesus used that you talked about in the book. Very stimulating ideas.
Well, the way the church is organized now has been dictated by our politics. Because if you're going to be a church that accepts donations, then you have to have a board, and you have to have this kind of organization in order for that to be, for the state to recognize you. Now, that's only if you want to be able to subtract your contributions from your taxes. And so that has killed us in a lot of ways, because churches then adopt systems that are not necessarily biblical. We have elders, and that's okay. But then we limit it to so many because we have to have an elders board, and they have to be able to call the shots. And then Well, I remember the last church I served, and that's probably prophetic, as pastor. Uh, I decided to really do the thing, and so we took a constitution they had that took almost a ream of paper and reduced it to front and back page. And I said, now, folks, this won't work unless we do it, you see. And if we don't do it, then we fail. We don't have anything in here that protects us from failing. We ought to fail if we're going to fail. So I said, let's try this we're not going to do any more elections. We're going to try to see what God's saying to us. And I said, let's try it for 2 years and then vote again, because it just scared them. They were Americans. They want to vote on everything. So they finally decided, just barely got the necessary number, 3/4 of the people to agree to it. And after 2 years of our new system, I said, well, folks, it's time for us to vote. And they looked at me in shock. Vote?
Oh, wow.
I said, yeah, I told you that we'd vote on this again if you don't like it, And the annual business meeting was what they hated most of all, because good, wonderful people turned into donkeys at the annual business meeting, and we didn't have that anymore. So it barely got past the first time, but the last time it got 98% of the votes to keep it. So
okay.
That was it. After that, we just enjoyed being the church.
There was a denominational church that I was involved with years ago, and they wanted to change their constitution. And they had a very complex voting membership style, thing. And so I presented a different constitution for them that didn't have a congregational vote. In fact, it didn't even name any members. There wasn't a membership. And the chairman of the deacon board loved it. He thought it was great. And so there was a vote. And they didn't realize that was the last vote they would ever take. But the fruit of that, Gayle, has been that the people relaxed. They didn't have to be involved in the politics of the church. And so they were able to just focus on what they were actually there for, which was to love Jesus, grow, serve others, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I asked the congregation, what's the time of the year that you despise the most? And they all said annual business meeting.
Oh, my.
Because people who are just sweet little sheep turned into donkeys at that meeting, man.
Yeah. Boy.
We didn't do that anymore.
Mm-hmm. Well, in the focus on that and on the structure of the church, then you made the comment about, if you take donations and you're having to satisfy the requirements of nonprofit, deducting your contributions and whatever. I just wanted to ask you a question. I mean, we haven't faced the overt persecution in the United States, obviously, but some are predicting that we are going to someday, and maybe even in the near future. And where this whole tax-exempt status and the whole 501c3 thing is just going to go away, sail off into the sunset. And so now we're going to be freed from those kinds of things. It'll be burdensome in other ways for pastors, but freed from other ways. What's your opinion about all that? What do you think? And if that does happen, what should pastors be doing now to prepare for it?
Probably to talk about it, to starting with their board, because it'll be quite a different thing. The Bible never hints at that, but we have decided that it's a good thing because we want the contributions and people want to be able to subtract them from their income. But maybe that's a false system entirely, that we take care of each other. Maybe we get jobs. Maybe pastors have to work, which is not a bad thing. I've seen it a lot. I had to. My first 2 churches did not support me at all, and I had to work. But I loved it, and they loved it, that I did it for them. And that church still exists, man. They've had 3 hurricanes that have destroyed their church, but they keep rebuilding it. And the next church that I went to was 50 years old, but it was the denomination's headquarters church for that state. And the leaders had wanted, I guess they liked what I'd done down there, wanted me to be their pastor. And, but it desperately needed to be relocated. Okay, so I looked, and finally there was an 85-year-old lady who owned 35 acres, a perfect place on the highway at the edge of town. And I kept visiting with her, and I finally said, okay, I want, the reason I enjoy our meetings, but we want to buy your land. And she offered it for 1/4 of its price. And I took that before the congregation. Everybody has to vote in that denomination. Mm. They voted it down. Wow. And I said, well, folks, I think I love you, but I don't think I'm your pastor. So I left shortly after that and went to a church that was 60 years old. And I was pastor number 52.
No way.
Yes.
Oh, gosh.
And they had, I look back and I think, God, you've got a sense of humor. This was a church that they decided to build in the silk stocking area of town, the really elite area of town. And nobody from that part of town came to the church. But it's a very nice building, man, and fit for elite. It now doesn't even exist. I thought after I was there for a year and a half, and that's when I got my invitation to be on the denomination's headquarters staff.
Okay.
I thought, this church really doesn't have a right to exist.
Wow.
And it doesn't now.
Yeah. Some churches should just conduct a good funeral for themselves, right?
Yeah. Well, I say it doesn't exist as a white church.
Ah.
And I laughed and I thought, this is wonderful. Right in the middle of the silk stocking area of town in a very racist area. This is now a black church.
Oh, wow.
That was in Mississippi, of course.
Mississippi, yeah, right. Well, Jesus said to his disciples, as you've written extensively about, that he would build his church. And
Right.
And there was a point early in your ministry where you wondered if perhaps we misunderstood what Jesus meant about building his church. And then you heard the gentle whisper of the Creator, you wrote, speaking to you. And he said to you, what you see in the church is not what I built. It's what you built. And then you concluded that there's only one option that remains, and that's to start over with the correct foundation, which is hard to do. So you've already talked about it a little bit. What did you see that caused the disillusionment? But how did the words, I will build my church, give you hope, give you freedom, and help you moving forward as a pastor?
Well, I really think that the way we have ruined it is to make it, first of all, in a building and make those nice so we can boast of them. The church that continues, that I pastored to this day, is that very first one's been destroyed 3 times by hurricanes. And they don't build back fancy because they know we might not be here very long, but they've continued as a church. I have problems with church buildings because they're sources of pride, and they are also extremely costly. They keep us, they divert monies that should perhaps be used in other ways just for the paying off of the building and the upkeep of the building. And it slows the church down to virtually nothing because it just takes everything to me, the ideal is homes, that we meet in homes in small groups. We relate to each other because we have no reason not to. And in those smaller groupings, we learn to really apply the word, and we learn to be real. And this is the thing that I was so glad when Calvary Chapel came along that didn't care how you looked, because you dressed up to go to all of my churches. I hate ties with a passion. And so it would be a very natural thing that wouldn't care how you looked or what status you were in the world or how much money you had, but it would be a place where we could be real people. And I remember, I think I've said this to you already, maybe even today, how when the pastor would ask for prayer requests, they would be so surfacey, split ends and things like that. And he said, then how many unspoken requests? And every hand would go up. And that would break my heart. I would think, man, why is it that which is deepest, we don't have the opportunity to share? But I found out that in small groups, you'll share. If the leader is that open and shares himself, then everybody else will too.
Which means that if a church does want to open up small groups or home groups or whatever we might call them, it needs to be an environment where people can share, and it's not going to be a replica of the Sunday morning pulpit in the middle of the stage and everybody's just listening.
Let me tell you a really crazy story. After I left headquarters, I was invited to go to a church whose pastor I loved dearly and be an assistant and to build a small group ministry there. Well, it just so happened that there was a man in the church who was one of their leaders who was a real denominational guy, and he knew what I had done at the headquarters of the denomination. He said, we better start him on our own now, or he'll come in and do something radical. So they started small groups, but which they were simply a church service squeezed down with pews, and pulpit, and you just preached to small crowds. That was his idea of a small group. So when I got there, my first statement was, folks, the small group ministry is over. They clapped for me, shouted. And the pastor then said, well, what are we going to do? I said, well, let me start one and just go from there. I'll example it. So they had asked me to come because I do have a master's degree in counseling, to be a counselor, because there were a lot of people that needed it. And I realized I can't counsel this many people. So I started a small group of my sickest people, and God made me suffer a little bit for calling them sickest. And you know what? There was such an incredible amount of healing that went on that spouses of some that were in there said, can I be part of it too? I like what you've done for my wife or my husband. I need that too, And it was just simply being the church, listening to everybody, loving everyone, praying for each other. Oh, man. And then I started the next one, with the leaders of the church. And the embarrassing thing was they just said, and I had hoped they wouldn't, that they got more out of that than they did out of church services, But they told the pastor that, and I don't think he wanted to hear that. But I find that's always true. And yet we don't go that way because there are stronger things in our culture that point us to being impressive. And small groups are not impressive.
I've never met a serious believer who's serving others and using, the Holy Spirit is using them through gifts of the Spirit, that kind of thing, that hasn't learned about those things in a smaller context. They didn't learn it on Sunday morning. They learned it in small groups, connecting with other people. Somebody said, I think you've got the gift of teaching. And then, really? You think I do? And so they start, and it's fruitful. Or I think you've got the gift of helps or the gift of ministry.
Chuck Smith told me that was the way Calvary Chapel was started, with small groups.
Yes. Yeah, I believe it. So what about that pastor, Gayle, that, the church that he pastors grew numerically suddenly, and most of what was going on was based around Sunday morning, and they think, we're about an inch deep in some ways, the goal here is to help people mature and equip them for ministry. So I really need to go in this direction of small groups, but they've not done it before, or there's been very little of that going on in the church. What do they do? How do they, I mean, that's a big paradigm shift.
Well, that's what I did at my last pastorate. I decided as the pastor, I'm going to start small groups. I won't make the people have to be in them at all. I started with leaders, some of my leaders, but others that wanted to be in it. And we just really prayed for each other, cared for each other. And then another group started. In fact, after I'd been with them about 6 months, I said, okay, now this group is over. Now I want you to go and start groups. You know what to do and how to do it. And it just simply works that way. Then when I did one at the church where I was an assistant after I was at headquarters, people started asking to be in the group. They said, I like what you've done to my spouse. Or I didn't do it to him, God did. But I need help, And so by the time I had I left, I was only there 1 year, and I'd only had 2 small groups. But it had become so powerful that one of the persons who understood said, can I continue this? And I found out that there had been more than 20 groups that had begun not long after I left.
Oh, that's fantastic.
So
that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Well, it can be done then with the pastor that's willing to take a risk of faith.
Well, and risk himself to others, because we pastors tend to sort of be viewed as pretty spiritual. Uh-huh. And we're just like everybody else.
We are. Indeed. Well, so now I'm going to go to another chapter in the book, The Body Style, Gayle. And this one, I just loved it so much. I did. And it's one of the things that made me want to go pastor another church again, just to do it this way. But it was the chapter entitled Communion. And I was raised as a Roman Catholic, and so I'd known nothing but the Roman Catholic approach until I got saved. In fact, when I attended Calvary Chapel in Costa Mesa for the first time in 1969 in November, first time I'd ever been at a Protestant church.
Oh.
So I knew nothing of anything. And so my ideas of communion, were somewhat influenced by that. But it was quickly apparent to me that it's about remembering Jesus and what he did for us. But you wrote that your purpose was to take some positions on communion that are on the grace side of the fence. How we as non-Catholic, non-Roman Catholic churches practice communion. You took positions on communion that are on the grace side of the fence instead of some of the harsher approaches that we've taken. Okay. And then you commented on 11 different grace-oriented issues related to the way we practice communion today. It was an awesome chapter to me. So what did you write? Maybe you could talk about it a little bit. I think it was great.
Well, thank you. It's page 67, if anybody happens to have the book, which they can still get, by the way. See, I don't necessarily remember them now, so I'll refer to the book. What did I say?
What did I say?
First.
Let me quote myself here.
Yeah. In of course, the Catholic denomination, they think that you have to have had the hands that Jesus or Paul or whatever laid on you, and then down through otherwise you're not authorized to do this, of course. And Jesus didn't say that, and so you don't have to have special authorities to give communion.
Right.
Just be a person. You can do it with your husband and wife. My wife and I do communion frequently together, and it's only natural. I tell people, because if you have trouble praying with your wife, and a lot of guys do, they just don't pray with their wives. I said, if you have communion with your wife, it just is a natural thing to follow that with prayer. Mm-hmm. And I've had so many guys thank me for that. They said it changed their lives. And that's a beautiful thing that can come out of communion when even just two people do it in their home.
Yeah.
Why not?
Yeah, why not? Mm-hmm.
One of the things that people worry about is the warning about doing it unworthily and so forth.
Yes.
But let me explain that.
Please.
That early church, they finally had grown to the point that there was some separation between the rich and the poor. And when they would gather in homes, and it'd be a meal time, maybe the rich would bring food, the poor wouldn't. And what would happen is before communion, the rich would eat their food and the poor would watch. And that's the unworthily Paul was talking about.
Mm-hmm.
It isn't an unworthiness. It's not recognizing who your brothers and sisters are, treating them accordingly. And that's the unworthiness. It isn't, I mean, we're all unworthy as far as that's concerned, in terms of just basic life. But when we mistreat our brothers and sisters or relegate them to lower status, just the opposite should have happened. The rich should have brought the food, especially for the poor.
So that's what Paul would have meant by the statement, you're not discerning the Lord's body. He's talking about the body of Christ.
Absolutely. Simple as that.
And plus, on top of that, some of them were coming to the service drunk, or they were getting drunk at the service. I mean, so somebody worries about unworthy, and I say, okay, tell me this. Have you ever come to a communion service drunk or gotten drunk at a communion service? And have you ever decided that you're going to eat your own food and not share it with anybody else and do that on purpose to slight other people? If you've done that, then you've been unworthy. But I don't think that's what you're talking about.
But I've thought of, you can't, even if it's real wine, you can't get drunk off of that little thing.
No. You have to chug an awful lot of those.
Right.
That's good. Well, you also talked about, the parents that come to you and say, how young or how old do my children have to be before they should receive or can receive communion? And you had a great answer. I loved it.
Oh, as early as they want to remember Jesus.
Oh, man, there you go.
Yeah. That can be very early. Very early.
Yeah.
Even as a toddler, you can have communion because you want them, and they will remember Jesus easier than anybody else. They'll see Jesus as their friend when you do that. I go to a church often. I haven't been able to lately because I quit traveling. That was really close to the pastor, and on a communion Sunday, I said, would you mind letting me lead this and do and just mess up everything? He said, sure. So I told him when it came time for communion, I want you to go get the children out of the Sunday school now and bring them in and have them stand here in front of the. And I said, when they circled then the communion table, I said, if you're a parent of one of these children, I want you to come and stand behind them. And boy, I'll cry thinking of this. And I said to the children, I said, I want you to know who you are in God's kingdom. I said, you have actually a special angel who talks to God about what's going on with how we're treating you down here. And they have access to the Father, to God. So you're pretty important. And this that we do is so important. We want you to do it with us. And I said, if you're a parent, come in and stand behind your child. I want you to give your child communion. And I said, if your parent is not here, I'll do it. I'll give you communion, There wasn't a dry ice in the house. Dry in the house. And later I asked the pastor, did I mess things up for you? He said, we have to do it this way every time now. The people won't let me get away with anything but this.
That is so wonderful. That's just so, I can just imagine, this is going to become a thing, but it's going to be a good thing. It's going to be good.
Well, if you love your children, why don't you want this to happen to them?
Right. And then, along those lines a little bit anyway, the apprehension that we have about those that are pre-Christians or non-believers taking communion in our services. So we make a big deal about that, and we create this foreboding Mount Sinai kind of an environment and in the church. So what's your response to that?
My wife and I, we can't attend church now because of the pandemic, but there's a denominational church, an older one, down the street from us we'd go to. And I loved the pastor. He and I would get together every week for coffee and just talk life over. But during communion, he made this statement that, and it was an open communion, basically. You didn't have to be a member of the church. And had they required that, I would have just stood in my pew. And that would have embarrassed them, really, that I didn't come take communion. I said, well, I'm not this denomination.
Right.
But he did make this statement, which I hear all the time. If you're not a believer, perhaps you should let this pass by and not partake of it. And this pastor would say that too. And I said to him, Jesus didn't say that.
Mm-hmm.
I said, what a wonderful way to actually invite people to come to the kingdom. Say, if you're not a believer, we welcome you to take part of this and do what we do. Think of Jesus while this is going on, and it changes everything. It changes everything. Otherwise, you're slapping a sinner in the face.
Yeah.
Well, and that pastor did. He changed that.
Oh, good.
From then on, if you're not a believer, we still want you to come and do this,
right,
and help us remember Jesus.
Sometimes they can actually receive the Lord and do receive the Lord as they're taking the elements.
I believe that. Yeah. I think it would. You're more likely for that to be a moment of their saying, okay, I believe in Jesus now. I'm receiving him. I'm taking his body and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Much more than what we call the altar call, which can be an intense and scary thing,
mm-hmm,
which isn't really the way the kingdom's supposed to be.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and then that person comes and responds, and new life enters them, and they don't even know how it happened. And just like the new birth, the wind blows where it wills.
Do what we do. Think about Jesus.
Yeah, we do. Well, I remember all those years as a Roman Catholic, Gayle, and I wasn't a believer, and the Lord never killed me. And it was every week. He could have killed me every week if he wanted to.
Well, I know, but he is very patient.
He is very patient, very patient. Well,
yeah, take a sip of these, and someday it'll get through to you. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. At this time, we're going to take a brief break, and then we're going to resume our discussion with Gayle Erwin about the shape of the church, Jesus style. We'll be back real soon.
You've been listening to Strength for Today's Pastor. Foyman Ministries appreciates your participation in prayers. If you'd like to help financially support this podcast, you can go to our website at foymanministries.com/donate. Thank you.
So now we're back with Gayle Erwin. Gayle, we're going to just talk about one more question, which sort of rounds out this very brief summary of the body style. But you wrote a chapter in which you entitled the chapter "Neighbors," focusing on the story of the Good Samaritan. And the story was, of course, Jesus' response to the lawyer who had said, "What should I do to inherit eternal life, teacher?" And Jesus said, "Well, what's written in the law? What do you read of it?" "Well, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "Well, you've answered rightly. Do this and you'll live." Keeping the bar real high. But
Jesus even at one point said, "On these two commandments hang all the Bible."
The whole Bible, right. So do this, do it 100%, basically. Do it perfectly with no defect or no interruptions, and you'll live. But he, wanting to justify himself, knowing that he just had been commissioned with an impossibility, he said to Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" So it'd be great if you could just summarize the story and tell us what you see in it. Who is represented by the Samaritan in the story? Who is represented by the innkeeper in the story? And what does it mean for the church today?
Well, that story answered a bunch of questions. First of all, the Jews hated the Samaritans, and that then immediately, when the Samaritan becomes the hero in the whole story, that kind of tells us anything about racism. You just can't be a racist. Now, I grew up I was born in, my dad wasn't, but my mom was a racist, And so I grew up around that, but I never bought into it. And because I think that if I'm going to be a follower of Jesus, I love people, period. And some of their thoughts were, well, they're not really people, And I said, I can't buy that. But anyway, just knowing Jesus and his love for people has shaped everything about me. And, where was I going with this?
The story of the Good Samaritan and how it's affected and influenced.
They hated the Samaritans. Yeah. And the Samaritan is the hero. Jesus just answered so many things. And I said, this should tell us that we could never be racist in our lives at all. Everybody, maybe the one we think is the least is the one that's a hero in Jesus' story. And I said that Samaritan, and this was a thing to have to call him the neighbor, No, we can't do that to a Samaritan, but Jesus did. And then I think the inn or the place where the guy said, okay, take care of him, nurse him, I'll pay for you. That's the church, Jesus rescues people and brings them to us to get them well. Mm. And we should be able to do that, even if we don't like the guy that brought them there. Mm-hmm.
Well, that changes everything concerning outreach. It really does. I mean, outreach is simply being cognizant of people's needs and then going to them to help them.
Let me tell you a little story, if I haven't already. I was invited because of my teaching in college. One of my students who had recorded some of it at my permission, took it with him to what was then Rhodesia, that was be part of a missions organization. And Rhodesia, like South Africa, was an apartheid state. And they wanted to have the first, what they call charismatic interracial meeting. And they said, well, who can we get to come and speak at it? Because we can't pay them or anything. So he said, well, listen to these tapes. And they invited me to come.
Wow, what an honor.
I decided that I'm going to, about 40% of the group there in that auditorium, they're seated 1,100, were blacks, but they sat in the back. But I just went and lived with them. I ate with them, and I got to know them. I'd ask them about themselves and so forth. And one guy came up to me on Thursday who was actually a pastor, and I think I had spoken for him, but he said, I'm going to break every rule here, but I've got to tell you. He said, I'm part of the Secret Service, and I was appointed to watch you. And he said, if we had treated the blacks like you have this week, we would not be in a civil war right now. I said, voila, But then on Thursday, at lunch, they asked each speaker to sort of give a message on how I got this way. So on Thursday, I chose to tell how God had dealt with my racism. And I saw one black guy. Have I told this story already to you?
Well, I've heard it, but okay. No, go for it. Let me finish it.
I decided to tell about how God had dealt with my racism. And I noticed a black guy really getting excited while I was speaking. And he came up to me afterward and told me his name, Ezekiel Guti. And, that was just, I didn't know anything about him. And he said, I'd like to show you my office. Now, I've seen offices, and I started to say, well, thank you, but I'd rather not. But God sort of whispered, if you don't go, Gayle, I'll just have to kill you. I said, okay, yes, I'd like to go. Well, it was only about a block and a half away, and it was a high-rise building, and he had the whole second floor. Nobody knew that because they didn't talk to blacks. And when I went in, the place got very quiet, man. And I found out later I was the first white to enter it. And he, in front of all those people, said, now I'm going to kneel down and I want you to lay hands on me and bless me. And I felt, well, boy, that's quite it. I was pretty proud to do that. And then God said, no, if you do, I'll just have to kill you, Gayle. So I grabbed him by the shoulders and lifted him up. And I said, no, you're a much greater man than I am. I'm going to kneel down here and I want you to lay hands on me and bless me. And he did. And from that moment on, I could go anywhere in that country. I was as black as anybody else. And I ended up coming back every year and teaching his pastor's conference, which would be huge. And it was amazing. And at one time, I know after I had been doing this for several years, Ezekiel Goody and I were resting in a house in a yard that kind of overlooked a valley. And he said, why do you love us? I said, well, Goody, it's because of Jesus. He said, no, other people come here. For 3 months, they love us because of Jesus. And then they don't love us. Why do you still love us? And I said, well, listen closely to what I teach about the way Jesus is. I want to be like him. I love him. And that means I love you. And later on, his wife said something to me when I was at lunch. She said, now, you're his friend. So we Zimbabweans, we don't use that word friend like you Americans do. He said, you're my husband's friend, and you're his only friend. And I thought, well, what can I say? I mean, I wasn't coming in with the thought I'm going to be your friend. I'm as black as you are.
What I'm hearing in that story, Gayle, it just kind of reminds me of those that are involved in cross-cultural ministry in different places, like in Africa.
Yeah.
And I noticed that the whites from the West that really are effective are the ones that have great respect for the black people, for who they are. They're the ones that did like you did with Ezekiel Guti. You raised him up and said, you're a much greater man than I. You should be, praying for me for blessing. And that's the attitude they have towards people. So to me, it seems like respect is a big deal with all of this, love and respect, in terms of helping them see that we really are for whoever that is.
And as far as the body of Christ, which we call the church, if we could just have it in ways where we do pray for each other and get to know the needs of each other, because people don't know. I feel so sorry. We're built around the Greek theater style. We have to hire somebody who can really move us. And if they don't move us, they don't get money. And we hire somebody else. Oh, that's so sad. I don't know what to say, except maybe something is yet to happen.
Yeah.
It will force us into home fellowships.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Gayle, at this point, I'd love to give you a couple or a few minutes, whatever the Lord has laid on your heart, to say specifically to senior pastors, on topic or off topic. The topic will be Jesus, I know, but I mean, anything you want to share to strengthen them, encourage them as we kind of move towards the conclusion of this time together.
Well, one of the things I found out as being a pastor is that there is a tendency to want to protect yourself and to, not be too open with your congregation. But somehow you need to be in a situation with 2 or 3 or 4 others at a minimum where you can just be real and learn to do that and realize this is the best thing that's ever happened to me. Yeah, and it would be the best thing that would happen for your congregation. So after my experiment with it in Illinois, and I had first the very sick people, and then the leadership. One of the elders said that I didn't want him to do this, but he said to the pastor, he said, "This is the best time of the week for me." He said, "I get far more out of it than I do in church service, you know." And I said, "Oh, okay." But after I left, within 3 months, 21 new groups had been formed. And I thought, well, that's a pretty good illustration. And if nothing else, the pastor needs to be part of one. If you don't have your church organized that way, that's probable that you're not going to be able to do that. This will have to grow organically. And the way to grow it is you be part of one. You put one together yourself where you can be honest and open, and even, if possible, let someone else lead it, and then see what happens.
That's a great challenge. That's a great word. Appreciate that.
And then after 6 months, say, okay, now, every one of you go and start a new group.
There you go.
And I will too, and see what happens.
Yeah.
It can be done.
Organic. I love the word organic. That's what it is.
Well, yeah, and it's so impersonal now.
Yeah.
I realize you can go to church and they can pray and so forth, but you will leave there with the same problems you came with, the same needs you came with, because you were not really prayed for. You were given the common prayer, "Now God bless everybody." Mm-hmm. Okay, Thank you. But I'll be honest with you, I have seen more miracles in smaller groups than ever. And my past is the big tent revivals where the miraculous prayers that went on. Mm-hmm. And I know that one of the more famous guys would not pray for anybody that was really crippled. You had to be behind curtains, and that he would come out after the service and pray for you there, where you wouldn't be seen, which is an admission of failure. And if you wanted to be prayed for that night, you had to come to an afternoon service first to get instructions. And I thought, what a thing to do to sick people.
Yeah.
But I don't know why I told you all of that, but I've seen all of this, and I'm thinking, I don't think that's what you wanted your church to do and be like God.
Yeah.
There's hardly anything I haven't seen.
Yeah, right. Thanks, Gayle, for joining us. It's always a treat to have you, and I appreciate you and your generous use of time.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate your even asking me to do this. I enjoy the fellowship with you.
Yeah, I enjoy it too. I really do. It's been feeding my soul. Well, I recommend the reading or listening to the entire book, The Body Style. This book and all of Gayle's books, MP3 readings of his books and his articles, are available for free at servant.org. Servant.org. Just send Gayle an email, gayle@servant.org, and let him know what you need, and then he'll ship them out to you, and, just pay the postage, and that's about all you need to do.
No. We pay the postage too.
You pay the postage too? Oh,
my
goodness.
We pay the postage. Free is free.
Free is free. Okay, all right. So you don't even have to pay the postage. That's an amazing deal. Thanks for joining us today on Strength for Today's Pastor. And as they like to say in the West African country of Ghana, stay blessed.
Strength for Today's Pastor is sponsored by Pointman Ministries. You can find us at pointmanministries.com. That's spelled Poimen ministries.com. If something in today's program prompts a question or comment, or if you have a topic idea for a future episode, just shoot us an email at strongerpastors@gmail.com. That's strongerpastors@gmail.com. May the Lord bless you as you serve Him, His pastors, and His church.